This art process video is a bit different. I'll be painting, but the focus is on what comes before those first layers of color. I had sketched these ideas for a Pandora's box painting months ago, and even drew a more elaborate pencil study on toned paper to figure out expressions and poses, and to get a feeling for the illustration I wanted to achieve. But a big chunk of the process for this painting was the creation of reference images, and I'll show you some of the 3D tools I use for those. Keeping it simple, as I'm not an expert at all, but wanted to share how one could approach a scene with multiple characters, various colorful light sources, lots of hands, all the things that make taking reference photos of your own really difficult. I used two programs together to get my reference images, DAZ 3D and Blender. Both of these are free to download and have different fortes. In DAZ 3D, the actors, 3D models that you can pose, dress, give hairstyles, and even quite elaborate facial expressions are the big focus for me. When creating a scene in DAZ, you can just drop your models in there. The base models I'm using, mostly Genesis 8 and 9, but there are older versions as well, all come for free with DAZ Studio. This is where I started this process, using 4 main characters for my illustration, as well as later adding other figures just out of the frame with just their hands reaching in. 3D products can be pricey, but personally I've just been checking out the weekly freebies section a lot. There are often some useful models, clothing, hair, poses, even HDRI or light setups to be found here. I also have a wish list of things I'd love to have for future illustrations, and then I just wait for the occasional 75 or 90% discount events the site seems to be having quite often. Now personally I'm mostly interested in fantasy illustration, so of course my wish list is tailored towards that. Depending on your art interests, this might look very different, be focused on architecture, nature scenes, or more modern settings. I also focus on finding elements that are difficult for me to shoot reference by myself, with my camera and just me as the model. For example, I actually bought a set of armor a while back, as I've been planning and sketching for a medieval knight illustration. And metal armor is one of those things that can be incredibly tricky to find references in the right light and pose for. The same goes for male models, as asking my partner or friends to pose for things is always an extra step compared to just quickly shooting a few references of myself. Generally, I look for the most basic versions of designs out there. An armor with an intricate design like this one here would be much harder to adapt and make my own design of, using just the lighting and material information the model gives me, compared to a simpler design like the one I actually got. But don't worry about all the extras. I've started to dabble around in DAZ over a year ago and just slowly accumulated items as needed for specific projects. The basic free models are already a wonderful resource just on their own. Now let's take a look at my Pandora setup. For this scene here, I actually recently updated my models a bit for this video. Back when I posted these in December, I actually only had a single hairstyle and one single costume option that I gave to pretty much everybody. I did upgrade my collection a bit over the holiday sales and wish I had all of these extra options back then, even if just for fun. One thing to keep in mind, the more complex these scenes get, the harder it is on my PC. While I could render simpler scenes on my laptop in the past, by the time I had 6 characters and multiple light sources, all crowded together, my poor PC was complaining a lot. DAZ 3D really shines when it comes to posing. Not only can you move the individual limbs around like a wooden joint doll, but there are parameters to manipulate if you want the body types to look different, and even the facial expression of the model can be changed with these parameter sliders. There are also pose presets, which can be a great starting point to then adapt your own pose versions from. Now, you will always get something that looks made in a 3D program, and I always prefer real human photography for reference. 3D models can have a bit of an uncanny valley effect, but they are an incredible base to then build upon. I also used these references by Howard Lyon for the draped clothing in this illustration. The most important lesson for me to learn: I need a sketch and a clear vision for an illustration before I go into the reference creation. It can be fun to play around with camera angles, different models, poses, but it can also lead you into endless different directions, and it's during the sketching process that I figured out what I want to paint, what the story behind an illustration is, and how to present it. That's where I wonder about which format would be best, which composition carries the meaning across, and what each character should look like. And then, only after all that, I go hunting for references that fit my vision, not the other way around. When I find, shoot, and compile a reference photograph, I might adjust the character's looks or add new details, but I never want to force my illustrations to fit the references that I can find. The same goes for these 3D references. The lighting might reveal interesting possibilities I hadn't been able to picture in my mind, or I might change the position of a hand to make more sense than in my sketch. But this is still a tool that I can manipulate and adjust and build upon to match my idea. It's why I then draw the scene in pencil first and then paint it in multiple layers, trying to keep my art style alive no matter what references I use. This illustration was a big challenge for me. It had everything I struggle with. Multiple characters interacting, multiple light sources from different directions and in different colors, and so many hands. I think if my current painting skills were at this line here, the skills needed to pull off this idea hover around up there. But I wanted to push through to give it my all and see how far I could get. Because beyond the technical, the references, trying to combine my simplistic portrait style with a more realistic one, and all the different textures I needed to paint, I just wanted to bring this idea to paper. My biggest hurdle for this illustration was the size variation. The Greek gods creating Pandora are slightly larger than she is, to look more intimidating and inhuman and crowding. That's difficult to get right with real people posing for a photograph, especially if you're trying to do that on your own, but it's simple enough in 3D as I can scale the individual models and make sure that all the arms and hands touching each other make anatomical sense. I used the same approach as for my Dracula cover illustration. A pencil drawing on hot-pressed watercolor paper, then sealed with gloss gel medium to create a smooth, glass-like surface. That first watery acrylic paint layer on that surface creates such interesting textures. The paint can be pushed around, applies as a thin glaze, and I find it a wonderful way to clear my thoughts, find color combinations that work, and slowly explore the painting. As I started painting, I had a clear vision for my color palette, keeping it very simple by focusing on basics like burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, both of these did about 80% of the work here, and burnt umber, raw umber, some alizarin crimson and phthalo green, and azurite blue for the magically glowing elements that identify the different Greek gods. I have a full palette breakdown as a blog post over on Patreon. The brushes I used were mostly my usual cheap silicone brushes. Those hold the perfect amount of water and paint for those earlier transparent color layers and then have enough resilience for the heavier opaque color layers that follow. I also wanted the gods to be illuminated by blue light, while Pandora is hit by a warmer light source. Colorful light sources are another element that can be difficult to photograph if you don't, by some happy accident, have access to photo studio equipment at home. While I did take some extra reference pictures of my own hands, hair and face with a colorful mood lamp held up close, that was the limit of what I could achieve at home. I found Blender to be a much more versatile and easy to control light creation tool. So that's why I combined both programs. It's a combination a lot of artists use, and so there's even a bridge program extension that helps you export your DAZ 3D models to Blender, and more detailed tutorials focusing on that exact process. I also used it to model architecture elements for a previous illustration to really build out a larger scene. Pandora is usually depicted curiously, thoughtlessly, opening her box and releasing evil into the world. That reflects so many other tales and myths of a woman specifically unleashing evil because of her nature. But I wanted to show the gods forcing her hand and sealing her fate. I went back to Hesiod's works and days for the myth of the creation of Pandora. She was meant as a punishment to men for stealing fire, and so she's shaped from clay, adorned as a temptress, and given a curious mind. And, of course, the gift to mankind, the jar full of all evil. She was created just for this, and her fate is sealed already. So in this painting she looks distressed, scared, and angry as her hand is forced, literally. I think we can all relate to that sense of frustration and helplessness sometimes in our own lives. Even if I struggled doing that painting idea justice, I think all the work that went into the preparation, from sketches to photographs to the 3D models, helped me get as close as I could at this point in time. I love sketching for practice, painting quick studies, and maybe some more expressive portraits, but every once in a while I want to give one particular illustration my all. How do you tackle paintings that you feel intimidated by? Do you, like me, prepare a lot? Do you paint multiple versions like some of the old masters did, paint color studies, or sketch a lot? I hope that in 2025 I can paint more elaborate paintings more often, as I learn so much from the entire process each and every time. Already I can see all these things I would have tried to paint differently, and it's barely been a month since I finished this. We can learn so much by pushing ourselves, even if it's then wonderful to go back to smaller pieces in our comfort zone. I'm now very excited to take everything I've learned about creating references and adapting them, and use that for painting future pieces. One inspired by Tolkien's Silmarillion is currently on my easel, and I have many more ideas to slowly enrich my portfolio and hopefully learn more about painting along the way. I hope that this gave you some ideas for using 3D models for poses or scenes that you might need a reference for, to tackle paintings you had imagined but can't quite bring to paper or canvas without building them first. Personally, I found that the time spent modeling and rendering these scenes is really worth it, and I'd love to hear if you gave Blender or DAZ a try, no matter if on their own or combined with photography or other reference material. There are a lot of amazing resources out there, tutorials, step-by-step instructions on how to build anything really, especially for Blender, and I recommend you take a look at those, as that's literally just what I did to get started. I've also linked some of my favorite resources in the description. The print for this illustration can be found via my Artprint Patreon membership. I used my favorite watercolor type paper for these, as it softens the look of acrylics, and I love how these turned out. If you enjoy my acrylic paintings, watercolor or pencil sketches, there are 2 different kinds of print memberships over on Patreon. While this is an acrylic painting on paper, I still wanted to give it a protective isolation coat. I don't usually varnish my illustrations on paper, that's more for gesso panels or canvas, but this unifies the different textures and protects from dust and scratches. It also keeps the temptation of repainting certain areas with time at bay, as I like to just decide that a painting is now finished and done and move on to the next one. Thank you so much for watching this a bit more unconventional painting process, as it was less about the painting itself and more about the preparation that went into it. And I'd love to hear from you if you're also a bit of a planner and preparer, or maybe if you're the opposite and you always go into your paintings very spontaneously and without any references. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next art video.